Holy Spirit. Christ is in our midst.
Yes, it never shall be.
Good morning, brothers and sisters. So, today I'll preach from the epistle reading, from the Acts of the Holy Apostles. This passage says two things to us. One is that Pentecost is coming, and that it speaks very intensely about Paul's desire not to celebrate Pentecost locally, but to go to Jerusalem. So great was this feast. And Jews had long had this custom of traveling to Jerusalem for this feast of Pentecost. So Paul is leaving, and he goes to Ephesus, and he gathers the bishops, presumably, possibly the presbyters also, that he has ordained, and he gathers them together, and he says his parting words to them. And he first tells them to be serious in their work, in their labors for the flock. And then he says to them, the Holy Spirit has placed you as bishops in the church, confirming them, affirming them, helping them to know where their power and their authority comes from. The Holy Spirit himself has made them bishops and has placed them here. But then he goes on to say that after I leave, bad things will happen. As in, wolves will attack the flock, and even some from among you will rise up against the flock. Now, obviously, the church is using this to speak of Arius. I don't know if Paul literally meant some of these men, physical men he was standing with, would betray the faith. That's not something that is totally strange, because the apostles chose 7 deacons, the last of which, I believe, was Nicholas, who betrayed the faith and became the leader of a group of heretics called the Nicolaitans. So even the apostles put their hands on people who did not do rightly. So I do not know whether these men betray Paul or not, but it fits Arius very well. And so what we can see is that St. Paul says, you are placed by the Holy Spirit. You have grace. You have the power of God to wield this office. But it doesn't make you infallible, right? Because men who will betray the church will come from this very place. And this is so fitting for Arius, right? Arius wasn't a bishop, but he was a presbyter, a priest, in the church of Alexandria. And he had received grace. He had received the real grace of ordination, right? This is not something that we can deny, right? Nicholas received the very same grace Stephen received. We all saw how Stephen dealt with things, right? He worked many miracles. He did many great things. And as he was being killed by the Jews, being stoned, he basically asked the Lord to forgive them. He said, forgive them. Or do not count this to their, do not lay this to their account. And then he goes peacefully to the Lord. So Stephen had much grace, and he utilized it, and he did much with it. With Nicholas, I don't know much about his life except that he became a heretic. But he had the same grace that Stephen was given, right? The question is, did he cultivate it or not? Arius received the grace of the priesthood and used it for a time until his heart was twisted by pride and he fell into heresy. And what is amazing is that he took many bishops with him. In fact, Saint Basil the Great, a few decades after the council, basically said most of the world is Arian. Most bishops are. If they're not Arian, they're at least very much supportive of Arius and of his heresies. So this is a very interesting thing Paul gives to us. He says to us that the grace of the Holy Spirit establishes the hierarchy of the church, establishes the bishops, establishes the priests. But they're not infallible, and St. Paul is warning them about this. That's why he's calling them to imitate him and to live as he did. But Paul doesn't end there either. Paul says, I commend you to God. This is what he says to them. After he's given them all this bad news, he says, I commend you to God and to the word of his grace. And St. Paul says, the grace of God is sufficient to help you and to guide you and to protect the church and to lift all up and to sanctify the faithful, right? So what do we see with Arius? We see that he betrays the grace of the priesthood, even though he truly had it and has it, or received it at the time he was ordained. And what happens? The Lord raises up other hierarchs to oppose him. The hierarchy is the special place that the Holy Spirit works through. It doesn't mean the Holy Spirit doesn't work through the laity, and at times he has. At the Council of Florence, only Mark remained faithful, and the lay people rose up and said, we will not accept Florence. And that was what it was. So God works, the Spirit of God works through all the baptized. But the hierarchy is the special place through which the Holy Spirit guides the church and makes decisions. And when Arius betrayed the faith, and many other hierarchs did too, the Holy Spirit raised up faithful bishops. Athanasius, who at the time was just a deacon, but he was raised up later to become patriarch of of Alexandria, right? So the real message Paul gives us is the sufficiency of the Holy Spirit. The sufficiency to give hierarchs and to give priests for the duties that they have, and the sufficiency to maintain them. While the Holy Spirit gives us the greater sufficiency of maintaining the church. This is a message that you all already knew, but it's something you have to think about endlessly, because you'll be confronted with the scandals that happen in the church. That the church is filled with scandalous priests and scandalous bishops, and bishops who are not faithful, or bishops who are not unfaithful to the dogmas, but are not faithful to their high calling, and the same with priests, right? And yet, the grace of God is sufficient. He is sufficient to work with those priests who are corrupt, those priests who are less than they should be. And he is also faithful to correct those who have erred drastically, or have even rebelled against God, right? The Holy Spirit is what maintains all of it. That's why Paul can say with such great confidence, you have been placed by the Holy Spirit in the church. And he can also say, I commend you to God, because ultimately the church is God's. Right? A man wrote to St. Nikolai Velimirovich, he said, does the Orthodox Church have a pope? You know, of course, he's asking the Serbian bishop this. And he says, yeah, the Holy Spirit is the pope of the church. The Holy Spirit is the leader of the church. The church is the church because it is the repository, the dwelling place of the Holy Spirit. This is what I had preached on yesterday. The only person here was Tim. Because we talked about how, in that reading, I'm trying to remember what reading it was, it's been too long. But basically, the Holy Spirit is granted to the church and fulfills and brings all things. Christ talks about how the Spirit will guide you into all truth, and that he is the comforter that will be sent. And in this case, the Holy Spirit is all sufficient and continues to be sufficient. And the hierarchy of the church, no matter how flawed it is, no matter how much it is filled with people that are not worthy of their calling, are rendered capable of fulfilling their calling through the Holy Spirit. Right? You kiss the hand of a priest because at the moment of the liturgy, Christ takes his hand and uses it. Right? Christ is using the hands of this man to perform this service. The priest himself may or may not be worthy of this calling, but God uses it in this moment. The Holy Spirit dwells with him and listens to his words, not because he's righteous, but because God is faithful to his church. He is faithful to the promises that he has made. And St. Paul is calling on us to be faithful to these promises, to trust in the Holy Spirit, to trust that he will guide the church, and to trust that he will make up always for that which is lacking, and that God will always correct that which goes astray. Right? The church will always remain. Will it always be of the same size? No. The church was once much larger than it is now. But it declined because of the sins of certain members of it. But the church will always remain true. And we must remain true to the Holy Spirit and to our calling that we received at our baptism. Amen.